John Glover, the sick granny killer.
The killer at large.
Convicted of murdering 6 vulnerable women.
Has been sentenced never to be released.
If you've seen the crime scene, you've seen the fantasy.
The second time in 24 hours, the unthinkable has happened.
He's enjoying this moment. It's very satisfying for him.
I'm Caroline Overington, an investigative reporter, and I've always been fascinated by Sydney's granny killer. Years after he died, when I was investigating the death of William Tyrrell, I met FBI profiler Kris Illingsworth, who had been on the task force that caught John Glover. She was sure they hadn't uncovered all of his murders. So we decided to team up, uncover the truth, re-examine the dark mind of John Glover. We've got the story from the inside, the cop on the case, the juror who put him away, and the journalist who made John Glover her obsession. John Wayne Glover was born and raised in England, emigrated to Melbourne in the 1950s, a so-called 10-pound pom, a nickname given to the British citizens who moved to Australia after the Second World War. Piecing together the life of this man is difficult, but there is no doubt he was a deeply disturbed and conniving individual. But there are clues. Our research shows that before he travelled to Australia, he'd been a petty thief and a peeping Tom, and he'd had deep issues with his mother. It's now believed that a young Glover spied on and found photos of his naked mother. Much later, the women he killed were laid out in death, in the same pose his mother had struck in those photos.
I mean, it was quite a specific pose they were in, and it was also incredibly insensitive, to his victims to leave them in that position. So when the police came in, the first thing they would see was they were so exposed, and that was almost like a message to say, this is what I found my mother in this situation, or at least I saw photographs of my mother. It was quite a misogynistic act, I think, that he did.
Some people even theorise that John Glover and his mother had a sexual relationship.
We can't ever prove he was sexually abused. He didn't admit to it, but he's not going to admit to it. I couldn't imagine him saying, well, that's actually what she did to me, because he did have quite a protective role about it. He didn't really denigrate her.
What we do know is that 30 years after he arrived in Australia, he committed the so-called granny murders. His spree started just 5 months after his mother died. Was he insane? It was the first question asked at his trial.
The defence is arguing that John Glover is mentally ill.
Interviews with jurors are extremely rare. There are strict laws covering what they can and cannot reveal. But tonight, Adrian Smith, one of the 12 people entrusted to decide the granny killer's fate, speaks publicly for the first time in more than 3 decades.
He just sat there nice and quiet and placid, and just looked around at us, the jury, and around the rest of the courtroom, and just a look of, when's this all going to be over? What's all the fuss about type of thing,
During the trial, Adrian says he locked eyes with the notorious killer many times.
You couldn't help but look at him, and I must admit I looked at him quite a bit thinking, he was such a nice style of chap, and you wouldn't have thought that he would have done what he did. And I kept looking at him thinking, how could you do what you did? You don't look that type.
It turns out to be one of the biggest murder cases we've ever had.
Yeah. Many person has done that.
The courtroom heard that he despised his mother, Frida, and later his wife's mother, who he thought was domineering and controlling.
And it was almost like a thing getting even with them, you know. And the things he did to the elderly ladies when he finished killing them was a sort of a thing to shame them and shame his mother and the mother-in-law, you know. Yeah, it was a thing to go back at them.
Whether John Glover killed the 6 women wasn't in question. After being caught in Joan Sinclair's home, he confessed to another 5 murders. So the jury had one main task: to decide whether Glover's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity would be upheld. Adrian can't reveal what was discussed in the jury's deliberation room, but he can discuss his own thoughts and what was heard by the court.
You started thinking, well, a person who does that must be insane, but then you came around to the idea that actually, weirdly, he's completely sane.
Yes. Yeah. Well, when you hear it briefly, and you've got to think, you know, someone's got to be insane to do this. You know, it's no normal person would do it. You know, but as I say, as you hear the evidence, you realise he knew every movement that he was doing. You know, yeah.
It's always a choice, and no one made John Glover murder people. He was a fairly ordinary sort of a sleazy type who would take you down if he could, or do whatever he could to get away with something, gratifying his own passions and thoughts. There was very little that one could find to like in John Glover.
For the first time, our investigation will reveal why the 6 murders Glover was found guilty of weren't his only crimes. There is ample evidence that many women met the same brutal fate. To best understand Glover, we'll first examine each of the known victims of the so-called granny killer.
We have no idea of the person responsible for this crime.
And establish his modus operandi. Then we'll go back to John Wayne Glover's early days, just off the boat in Melbourne, tormented by his childhood,
has prompted police to reopen investigations
and acting out his evil fantasies. The late 1980s in Sydney. Australia had just celebrated a bicentenary. Bob Hawke was Prime Minister, and the streets of the upper-class suburb of Mossman were safe and full of wealthy older Australians. The crime rate was so low that most people didn't bother locking their back door. John Wayne Glover was living in Mossman with his wife Gay and 2 teenage children. Well-dressed and dapper, he worked in sales at a pie company. Nobody would guess he was one of Australia's most notorious murderers.
So this is Mossman Village, a very small area. Obviously a beautiful suburb overlooking Sydney Harbour.
Yes, it's a wealthy suburb. And this was the most active area where the offender was operating. This was his hunting ground. Gwendolyn Mitchell-Hill was an 82-year-old woman. She'd been out at the shops at Mossman. She was walking back home and she passed by the Mossman RSL, and John Wayne Glover had been in the RSL having a drink and playing the pokies. As he's come out, they've passed each other and he's looked at her and decided she was the one to attack. And so he's gone to his car that was parked nearby and taken out a hammer from the car. She's taken her keys out, probably to access her mailboxes. And as she's rounded this corner, out of view, he's then struck her on the back of the head with the hammer. She was unconscious at that point. So he's operated very quickly And he's taken off her shoes, he's just placed them to one side, and he started to remove her pantyhose. And then he's just about to start to do what he's really there for, which is to strangle her with the pantyhose. But the lift in the foyer makes a noise. So he runs away. He disappears, no one sees him at all.
The fact that he has the hammer hidden in the car, can we take from that that he was ready to strike, perhaps for many weeks or many months before, and that there are other women out there that perhaps walked past that window or past his eye line that he decided for one other reason, maybe, but no, who could have been victims?
Yeah, definitely. This might have been his first known murder, but it wouldn't have been the first time he'd done something like this.
Just 2 months later, in the same neighbourhood, with nobody apprehended for Gwendolyn Mitchell-Hill's murder, another elderly woman was killed.
Now, Lady Winfreda Ashton was 84 years old, a widow. Her husband had been an artist, and she lived alone in Mossman. She had had a hairdresser's appointment, and she was heading back home. Now, around this time, John Glover had finished work for the day. He's seen her and once again decided she was the one that he was going to attack. He's pulled over and he didn't take the hammer out for some reason. He took out some gloves, white and green cotton gloves, and he's followed her.
Lady Ashton was momentarily out of sight of the busy road. John Wayne Glover chose his moment.
As she's turned right into the bin room, she's gone towards one of the bins, and that's when he struck. So he didn't have the hammer, so he's placed a hand around her mouth and he's pulled her and thrown her to the ground. She landed on her back. He's then gone to do what he was there for, which was to remove the pantyhose. So now he's got the time and the place to do it. So he's now wraps this set of pantyhose around her throat, and then he's tied it off twice, very hard. You can see from just the sheer force that he was doing this, how much anger he was experiencing, rage. This was overkill, and you see overkill when offenders are extremely angry and they can't control themselves at that point, so they've brought that rage with them.
When you use the term overkill, you mean literally Lady Ashton is already dead.
Yeah.
And yet he's tightening the noose around her neck even tighter.
Yeah. He's doing this all very deliberately. He's enjoying this moment. This is very satisfying for him. This is what he's really there for. So this was about defiling her. It was breaching her privacy as a woman.
It's a degrading thing to do, isn't it?
It's a very degrading thing, and the whole time he's dominating her. They're at his mercy.
Police tonight are warning that a deranged killer is on the loose.
Well, was it Lady Ashton? Yes.
It was some female person I know taking the garbage down, so I went down to talk to them, you know. And, well, when I went down there, I found Lady Ashton down the floor in the concrete, you know.
John Furkey, arriving on the scene, was one of the first people to witness the gruesome but meticulous way Glover posed his victims.
It really impacted him, so I can't see how he would forget that.
And I wonder if he had any idea whether or not the police were looking for a serial killer at the time, whether they realised what they had on their hands?
Mossman was in a state of disarray, fear, panic. It would be hard to think that he wasn't aware of what was going on in his own suburb. I found a John Furkey, who was reportedly Lady Ashton's neighbour, and he found her body. I've been out to the address and I've left a note under his door, and I'm really hoping that A, it's him, and he wants to talk to us.
Well, I went to the bedroom, and first thing I noticed, well, you know, she's on the floor with her head pointing away from me, and her legs straight out. She's straight. She had her shoes together. I thought it was a bit odd.
And could you see her face at all?
No.
It was pointing in the wrong direction?
No, she was on the face down, so I couldn't see it.
So you recognised straight away that it was a crime scene. Why?
So I did think it was murder because it was unusual. You can't have a heart attack, quickly take your shoes off, put it on the side. You can't do that. So I didn't touch anything. So I went upstairs to a friend of mine that I used to know there, David, called the ambulance. We didn't know what to do. And the ambulance came and they realised the same thing. There was something funny going here, so they called the police.
Because it was in the bin room, this was actually a contained scene. So the police got their first glimpse at what he was really doing at this scene, and they're able to take quite a lot of forensic information from that. He gets to stand back and look at her face down. And we see this time and time again with the other victims. He doesn't want them looking at him. He wants to look at them. So it's another part of his psychopathology, this really strong voyeuristic intent that he has.
2 unsolved daytime murders of elderly women in the small Sydney suburb of Mossman was terrifying. And 6 months later, with no clues on the Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill or Lady Ashton murders, in a neighbouring suburb, Glover struck again.
A child found the woman still alive near the end of a driveway in Lane Cove. She'd been attacked a short distance from her unit, 100 metres off Longueville Road.
Third victim that we know died at the hands of John Wayne Glover was Margaret Pard.
Margaret Pard was an 85-year-old woman. She lived in a block of flats in Lane Cove. She'd been up to the shops at Lane Cove on Longueville Road, was coming back with her groceries, and she's been attacked from behind, and she's been struck with what turned out to be a hammer. So she's found 70 metres down this pathway, this straight alleyway. He's followed it. He's at risk very much of being seen at that point because broad daylight, it's in late afternoon, and his intent was again to remove the stockings, or in her case, the stockings. But something must have happened. He must have been disturbed, so he's left very quickly. And he wasn't seen.
It's not known if the victim had been robbed, but police believe the murder follows the pattern established by 2 others this year.
That seems to be an incredibly risky thing for a killer to do, to walk down a long, narrow laneway. 70 metres is not a short distance. What, if anything, does this tell us about Glover?
Yeah, he felt quite compelled. He would have been assessing as he's following, because he had the hammer tucked in. He'd lift up his shirt and he'd tuck it into his pants, so no one walking by would see the hammer. So he would be assessing all the way while he's walking along, following behind her.
It's believed a killer stalked the elderly widow before hitting her repeatedly over the head with a blunt object.
Glover took her handbag and rifled through it, took the money and disposed of the handbag, and then he drove off to Mossman and spent the proceeds on the pokies and having a few drinks.
John Glover had always been a thief. He told police that as a boy in England, his mother taught him how to steal and pickpocket, and even encouraged it. Stealing from his murder victims became a sick compulsion.
With strong similarities to attacks on elderly women in Mossman, police today renewed their manhunt. Teams of detectives spent the day canvassing surrounding streets.
I was wondering if you may have seen the lady at all yesterday.
Murder was carried out in daylight in full view of a neighbouring retirement home. Gripped by fear, elderly people on the lower North Shore now are varying their daily routine.
Yes, very frightened. Well, wouldn't you be?
It's possible that local residents, potential witnesses, saw John Glover as he was arriving or leaving at one of his known murders. But they'd never think to report him. He was perfectly disguised.
He blended in very well at Mossman and all these other locations. He was always so well dressed. He was in effect camouflaged. He's a man who is 56, 57 years old later, greying hair, solid built across the shoulders, but overweight. So there's nothing intimidating about his appearance. In fact, he was unremarkable. He was completely non-threatening as well.
Crime journalist and author Lindsay Simpson agrees.
He was so practised at that blending in and, suddenly becoming part of high society in Mossman, where he lived, that he was very good. His acting ability was excellent, I think. He'd be the sort of guy who you'd see in a shop and he'd come up to you and start chatting about the weather and, you know, you wouldn't feel at all threatened.
He could have walked up that alleyway, having just killed Margaret Pard, and so long as he had no blood on him, no one would have noticed anything about him. They could have passed him and they wouldn't have thought twice about him. He just did not look like a killer in any way.
So, Kris, the very next day after Margaret's death, we have a fourth victim.
He wasn't fulfilled after the Margaret Pard's assault. He killed her, but he didn't get to do what he was there to do, which was to remove the pantyhose or the stockings and to strangle her with them. He didn't gain very much satisfaction from that. So the next day, his work took him to the Wesley Gardens retirement village in Belrose. He was on the premises there legitimately as a pie salesman. He just happened to see Olive Cleveland, one of the residents there, sitting on a park bench, just enjoying the afternoon sun, and she had a handbag with her. He has sidled up to her. He's decided to go and chat to her. And he sits down next to her, starts chatting. We don't know what he said, but at some point she decides to get up and walk away from him. He decides to follow her, and he's decided to attack her again from behind. He didn't have the hammer because he's there selling pies and he hasn't gone back to his car. So he's got her head and he slammed the back of her head onto the pavement there. He's then removed her pantyhose again, pulled her clothing up, taken the shoes off, placed the shoes to one side together. Has then been able to strangle her.
Killing happened here in Sydney's northern suburbs. At first, nursing staff thought the victim had died after a heavy fall. The area was washed away before the police arrived, and vital clues may have been washed away with it.
And while they're exposed in the most kind of degrading way possible, he's able to sort of enjoy that process of looking at them in their embarrassment.
Yeah, they're completely humiliated, degraded. He's completely dominating them. So I think these are definite sexual homicides by virtue of their clothing being disturbed, removed, pulled up, exposing their genitals, their bodies. I happened to be working at DY Detectives that day with my workmate, and we were the local detectives. We got a call from Frenchs Forest Police to attend, and we saw Olive lying there. And I remember standing on her left side, she's face up, and my workmate John was on the right side, and John tentatively pulled carefully at the ligature, and it was tight and there was contusion, bruising there. We just looked at each other and went, we've got to find a phone because this is another one.
Kris Illingsworth, then a young detective, joined a hastily assembled task force trying to catch the granny killer before he struck again on Sydney's North Shore. The streets were no longer safe. Dozens of police officers were enlisted, determined to catch the murderer. But John Glover continued to slip through their net and struck again.
Just 3 weeks later, we had another murder.
Yes, this was the fifth murder. Muriel Falconer, she was a 93-year-old widow. Muriel had been up to the shops in Military Road in Mossman and had made several purchases of her groceries. And John Glover was pulling up at the time and happens to see Muriel Falconer walking along the road by herself, heading home. So he goes back to his car parked nearby and he takes out his hammer. He follows her right behind her in her front yard without her realising that he's there. And she unlocks the front door and he's standing there behind her and lets her go in. And once she's inside, he then strikes the back of her head with the hammer. She goes down on the ground, drops her groceries as well. And He then starts to go to work for what he's there for. He removes a shoe, puts it to the side, takes the other shoe off, puts it over with the first shoe, and he starts to pull down her pantyhose again. So she's dead, and he still wants to strangle. So the strangulation is superfluous at this point, but this is all about his internal needs.
So this is a really important part of the crime for him.
That's right, and this is the overkill as well. And from that, he gains that sense of empowerment, the domination, and the control, which is seen time and time again with his crimes.
In the 1980s, Lindsay Simpson was chief police reporter at the city's biggest newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald. It was a tough job, with news of more and more elderly women slayed, demanding front-page stories. She later wrote a book about John Wayne Glover and interviewed the killer many times.
I do remember him saying that he waited behind the hibiscus bush and where he'd put the hammer. As soon as he started talking, it was almost like he was in that position and his whole demeanour changed, and it was absolutely chilling. His whole demeanour, it was almost like a mask sort of came across his face, and he changed from that congenial man to this hunted, horrible-looking person.
He'd pulled her upper clothing up. He has removed her cardigan. He's then rolled her over, and once again he would have stood back and seen a naked back of her, and he would have gained heightened sexual reaction from that, part of the sexual thrill of the crime as well. So from there he's walked back to the car, got back in his parked car next to the police station.
Kris Illingsworth had no idea how physically close she'd come to John Glover.
I was actually working in the police station at the time.
He walked past the police station to commit the murder and walked back again, and you were in the police station at the time.
Yes, and this is when the task force and all of Mossman, all the police, everyone was on high alert for the offender.
And such an incredibly brazen thing to do too.
Yeah, and it's daytime. This is summer, 23rd of November. People in the pub probably saw him come past, but he just didn't look like a killer at all, whatever that is. He really was the wolf amongst the sheep.
Catching this killer was proving incredibly hard for New South Wales police. He had left no forensic trace at his first 4 Sydney murders, but at his 5th murder of Muriel Falconer, he finally made a mistake.
So there were several shoe prints on her carpet in blood, and this gave a good outline of the offender's shoe. Now, this was the first bit of forensic evidence we had.
That bloody footprint would become key evidence, one forensic clue closer to the granny killer. And it wasn't just the footprint that had police excited. Someone had spotted John Glover.
What happened when you canvassed the neighbourhood? What did you discover?
We found there were 2 witnesses that had seen a grey-haired man in the street that day. One lady saw him, this man walking down the street, and then another person saw a grey-haired man, aged around 50, 60, walking back up Mustard Street around that time, walking briskly. And this was the first time this grey-haired man had come to our task force attention.
Finally, a picture of the granny killer was coming together. Not a young local hooligan or an out-of-towner, but an ordinary middle-aged man who looked just like them.
And slowly these dots were put together, and we go, this is the guy. And from that, as it turned out, Glover had been going to quite a number of these nursing homes and retirement villages, partly as part of his sales work, and going into the rooms of these elderly women who lived in these places. He would go in and pretend to be a doctor.
John Wayne Glover famously hated his domineering mother, but later in life those feelings of rage transferred to his mother-in-law, Essie, who he felt had too much control over his family.
One of the women he molested while pretending to be a doctor was in the same nursing home that he had placed his mother-in-law just a few years earlier. That mistake would give police the break they needed.
One of the ladies from the staff said, that looked like the fellow who used to visit that lady. And so he was identified first that way. And from there, a surveillance team was put on him and he matched the old grey-haired man, and it all started to come together. All the pieces of the puzzle just came together and it just fitted John Glover perfectly.
They now had a name to match the face.
So there was surveillance teams on him. He was seen prowling the streets. He was hunting.
On the day of the final murder, what were police doing?
So the police had followed him as they had been doing for a few weeks, and I think they picked him up about 9 a.m. when he came out of his house. We had a tip-off that he was going to see a lawyer, I think it was, someone, a professional person, to speak with her. He was followed to this house in Pindari Avenue at Beauty Point, which was not far from where he lived. And the police parked, watched him go in through the gate, and he entered the house. He was let into the house. So this is quite different to all of the other offences. And because we'd been told he was going to meet someone, there was no reason to have any concern at this point. Joan Sinclair, she was 60 years old, a divorcee.
She's a lot younger than the other victims as well.
A lot younger, yeah. So there were no red flags at this point at all. And he's carried his black leather briefcase in, and so it all looked very above board, professional meeting. And he goes in there, he's in there for a while, nothing's heard, past lunchtime. He doesn't come out. Probably up until that point, that's all okay, because if they knew each other, they're having some kind of interaction.
Even 30 years later, and living another life, as far removed from crime as possible, crime author Lindsay Simpson still has a crystal clear memory of that day and of that final murder told to her by John Glover.
And I remember him saying that he followed her down the stairs, and I think he did say he could still remember her face looking up, presumably when he hit her from behind. She must have realised just before she died that it was him.
When police entered Joan Sinclair's home many hours later, they found Joan's body and Glover semi-conscious in a bathtub after an overdose.
Do you think that it was a genuine attempt to take his own life?
I think he was very good at seeking attention, and I think he probably carefully orchestrated it so he wasn't dead.
John Glover was caught at the scene of his final murder. Establishing his guilt wasn't difficult. But it was the unusual way John Glover would pose the bodies of his victims, face down with the bottom half of their body naked, buttocks exposed, that had become the chilling crime scene calling card. That pose was something he remembered from his troubled and confused childhood. He'd seen his own mother in that same sexually explicit pose.
Did he ever talk to you about the time that he found the photographs of her in sort of semi-pornographic poses?
And he was peeping through the keyhole, saw things that a lot of children wouldn't see at, teenage years. And the fact that he found the pornographic photographs, I mean, I guess we can't ever prove he was sexually abused. He didn't admit to it.
John had a good time with his mother. I think he was in his late teens when she was running various illicit activities, including, I think, selling grog and black market grog and that sort of thing. But she may well have been selling herself as well, because she was not an unattractive woman, and that was a ready source of income. I think John would have been aware of that and would have been intensely jealous and intensely angry about it. And that's one thing that makes sense of why he had to display the sexual parts of elderly ladies in later life when he murdered them.
We know that John Wayne Glover's mother had either posed for or been involved in pornographic photographs where her buttocks were exposed. What link do you make between what he is insisting upon doing to dead victims and those photographs that he saw as a small boy?
Yeah, it certainly had an impact on him when he was a small boy because he remembered it and he told the police about it. So it seems like he's, in a sense, recreating those scenes. There's some sort of mental connection, emotional connection going on between, seemingly, with that event and what he needs to do to these victims.
His method of killing elderly women was so unusual that it became his sick signature at each crime scene. And before his death by suicide in jail, the granny killer began finally hinting that he'd been responsible for many other deaths.
Yeah, he was very careful, actually, to conceal that he had done any other murders. But I remember telling us something about look outside the jail and there's so many pine trees and that'll give you the answer. It was certainly more than 6.
That perhaps this was the answer to the question that everyone was already asking, how many?
You know, the 6 he killed that we wrote the book about were killed in quite a short period of time. So I think, you know, if he was getting away with it, I mean, how many other people have been killed by him? If he did keep getting away with it, why wouldn't he keep doing it? If he had a compulsion to do it, he wasn't going to talk about how many, though. He wasn't going to help anyone out to say, well, actually, I did do that many. There was always that game, too, that he would play, though, about that often, you know, with Silence of the Lambs kind of approach to serial killing that I know and you'll never know.
To get inside the mind of the granny killer, crime author Lindsay Simpson had to spend plenty of time with him, but she'll never forget their first encounter.
I remember walking down this long corridor, it was so still in my mind, but we could see this shadowy figure at the end of the corridor, and his hair was the thing I most remember. I think there was light coming in from a courtyard or something, and his hair was all silvery, and he had this congenial look on his face, and there was that feeling of him putting out his hand and realising it was the same hand that he'd used to hold the hammer to kill his victims.
When John Glover first arrived in Melbourne from England as a young adult, he moved into a boarding house in Toorak. 20-year-old Jackie Casamento was living there with some friends. Jackie had come to Melbourne from Queensland.
And do you remember when John Glover moved in?
Early 1963 it was. This man came in too. He had one of the rooms at the back of the house. It was John Glover. We were so naive, being kids that have just left home and just come out and everything. He was about 8 or 9 years older than we were, but we just couldn't believe this man. He had a tenor voice. He could sing. Oh, his voice was just magnificent.
Handsome and fun, John made a good impression on everyone in the boarding house. But none of the young women knew that just a few months before Glover moved in with them, he had committed 2 very serious and violent attacks.
There were 2 incidents that occurred that he was arrested for. One was a lady, I think she was 73, Myrtle Ince, and she was attacked from behind. 3 weeks later, he did a very similar attack. Valerie Bird, a 25-year-old young woman, had been to the local Girl Guides meeting every Monday night, which finished at 10 p.m, and then she's grabbed from behind and he gets arrested. He gets charged with both. He spends 2 months in custody waiting for his trial date for the 2 sexual assaults. He's found guilty, but the judge gives him a 5-year good behaviour bond. Slap on the wrist, don't do it again. Glover got away with it.
If you were to see that kind of crime being committed by a young man now, would you instinctively know he will carry on and kill other women?
Absolutely. John Glover was a danger to women for decades.
It wasn't long before Jackie started to notice some strange behaviour from Glover.
One day, I was in the bathroom having a shower, and all of a sudden I heard a bit of giggling, and I thought, what's going on there? And I thought, there's someone in the room. And it was John. He couldn't see me and I couldn't see him. But I got such a fright. He could walk up behind you and you wouldn't know he was there. He used to always wear rubber sole shoes. And he could mimic you walking behind you, and then all of a sudden you'd realise there was someone behind you and it was John. That's how he operated. He had to learn to do that, wouldn't he? A man doesn't go around walking around following people around unless he's got evil intentions, perhaps.
Patricia Balderstone was a friend of Glover's girlfriend at the time. She remembers feeling extremely nervous when Glover arrived at her St Kilda Road apartment one Saturday, unannounced and uninvited.
He just turned up in the kitchen. He must have let himself in. And I thought, because I can remember it now, I still remember it. And I thought, what are you doing here? Why are you here? He had no reason to visit me because I wasn't that friendly with him. You know, I was pleasant, but not friendly. Anyway, he turns up, and then suddenly Dawn walked in, one of the girls I live with 2 armfuls of shopping.
To this day, Patricia believes her life was spared by seconds.
Something was wrong. Something wasn't sitting right because he shouldn't have been there, and he gave no reason to be there. He made no excuse up or gave any reason for him just turning up like that. He just had to go. Once Dawn walked in, he had to go. He left. He gave no explanation why he was there.
At the boarding house in Tashini Road, Toorak, Jackie and her housemates started to see a side of John that left them wondering about him.
But we used to sit out on the veranda. All of a sudden, someone said, "That's John over there." And we all looked, and he was peeping in the house opposite.
He wasn't mucking around and looking in the house next door. You actually caught him being a peeping Tom.
Oh, no, we caught him peeping through the windows. And there were families living over there, and he's looking through the window. So this was the first time we really noticed that there was something strange about him. Couldn't believe that he would be looking through someone's window like that at that hour of the night. And then there was this terrible murder, which happened. Mrs. Irene Kittle was murdered, and she lived about 10 minutes away from where we lived.
Irene Kittle was killed in 1963 outside her home on the corner of High Street and St Kilda Road. Irene had been out with her good friend Edna Mish, and they'd caught a taxi back home around about 12:30, 12:35. So they walked down this darkened back alley. She's been attacked. She was stabbed 3 times around her chest. We know that the offender didn't stay at that point because he didn't make sure she was dead. He's then run off, and that's allowed her to crawl through this alleyway.
When you picture the granny killer, you imagine Sydney's North Shore, not Melbourne. But what if a much younger John Glover started his murders here, a full 4 decades before he was apprehended? Bill Mears is Irene Kittle's nephew. In the 1960s, he and his mother lived near Irene.
We arrived at the crime scene at about 7 a.m. At that time, we arrived just as they were hosing down the blood off the footpath.
Do we know whether John Glover was living in Melbourne and working in this area at that time?
Very close. He would have only had to turn off just a few hundred metres to go there. So he knew this area, plus his girlfriend lived close by. So he was spotted by the occupant, which was a lady in there, and she called out to him, and the prowler ran off. So it makes sense for the prowler, having been disturbed, to go back around to where he'd come from, where he originated, go back through the alleyway. Meanwhile, Irene's turned into the alleyway and they've had this encounter. Now, the lights were out. The offender, the profiler, didn't know who it was. He would have probably been just as shocked as what Irene was, having this encounter in the alleyway. And it looks like he's just acted out in panic, in an act of self-preservation. I don't want to be caught, I've just been prowling. And he's lashed out with the knife and just quickly stabbed 3 times in her chest.
The police basically said to us that they thought she had challenged somebody after having been dropped off from a taxi in Commercial Road, she walked through this laneway, but was certainly dead by the time she got to the front footpath in St Kilda Road. Irene was a formidable woman. She was capable. She would, as a matter of course, challenged somebody who may have been doing something wrong. So it wasn't out of her character at all, is that she would have literally challenged, what are you doing?
Is it possible also that because he's had this peeping and prowling, that he's in an aroused state and he comes across Irene Kittle, an elderly woman, very vulnerable?
Yeah, he would have been sexually aroused from the voyeurism activities and in a heightened state. He could expect the woman who he'd just peeped at to call the police. So he's probably expecting the police to be on the spot fairly soon or a neighbour to come out and assist. So I believe that he's gone through this alleyway on the run from this being disturbed, and he's just encountered Irene there in the darkness, and he's done what he felt he needed to do to escape this situation that he was not expecting.
This is a good 20 years before John Glover is known to be operating as an active serial killer in Sydney, and it's in another state. Does the messy nature of this killing suggest to you that it's a killer who's just getting started?
Yeah, this killer was not experienced with using a knife.
There are many aspects of the Irene Kittle murder that fit with what is known about John Glover.
With this case, we see the prowler and the voyeur activity being very similar to him, and he's already had these convictions and interactions with the police.
This is the kind of thing he does in this neighbourhood. He peeps through windows,
right.
He looks at old ladies as they're getting into bed and getting undressed. This is classic Glover.
This is exactly what he does. And he's confident and he's competent at doing it. He's capable. He's a serial sex offender. He's a serial prowler by this stage. We know that. Yeah, there's someone who's is confident and capable of doing elaborate things for their peep and pry. So that tells me that he's experienced at this and he's very determined to do it.
Jackie Casamento remembers an incident with Glover right after Irene Kittle's murder that terrified her.
You heard about the murder in the street not far from where you lived. Do you remember raising that with John?
I did actually, yes. I got myself into awful trouble, and I thank God I was lucky. I was in the kitchen getting my dinner ready this night, and he came in the kitchen and he started stirring me. He was really stirring me. He just wouldn't stop. And I said, "Oh, John, leave me alone." And he still kept on going, and I had a knife in my hand. And this is stupid. What I did was really stupid, but it just showed us who we were living with, because I lifted my hand up with the knife in the hand. I said, "John, leave me alone." And I just said, "Remember what happened to Mrs. Kittle?" And he was laughing 1 minute, and the next minute he was in an absolute rage. He stormed out of the kitchen, and he took off out of the room, and he was in an absolute rage. It was scary to see how he could change from one person to this other person. When I think about it now, I just get a chill up my spine. I just got such a fright when I saw how he went out in that rage. Just to see any person like that, I'd never seen anything like it in all my life, actually.
And Jackie also remembers numerous incidents with an elderly woman who lived in the same boarding house.
There was an old lady that lived in the boarding house that we lived at, and she'd been a school teacher. She was a well-educated woman. She was a nice white-haired old lady. She used to come in the kitchen all the time, and she'd be saying, "Get away from me, you filthy beast. Get away from me. Don't come near me. Leave me alone. Stop looking in my window," and everything. And this was going on all the time, and we thought she was off her mind. But I think he might have been tormenting her. His room was right near hers. Well, one day he said she was so distressed, this woman, "Leave me alone. Don't look at me all the time," and everything. And then he yelled out from the kitchen, he said, "Get him down, love, I'll be out in a minute." So, he was laughing when he said that. And I thought, then looking back now, I reckon he was probably tormenting her.
He was actually nominated by someone who had concerns about his activities, And police did speak to him. He was given an alibi by his girlfriend at the time, the lady who lived in Middle Park, but it all came down to what she told the police.
Next time. Did John Glover, the granny killer, murder Irene and get away with it?
And he just marked this X on the map.
But it was where Irene Kittle was killed.
It was exactly where she was killed.
And were there many, many more?
She was found inside her home in the hallway and she'd been strangled with her own pantyhose. In my view, this has all the hallmarks of John Wayne Glover's crimes.
His sick and twisted relationship with his own mother.
I always thought there was some sexual interference by his mother on him. And I think when she started having passion for other people, that he felt hugely rejected.
Plus, the never-before-seen photographs that reveal his double life.
When you have a narcissist and a psychopath, that's a very dangerous person.
It's the missing piece. It's how we get to know him.
And if they are acting out using sexualised violence, then you will have a serial offender, a serial rapist, a serial killer.